as an economist, you actually venture outside of just typical econ topics. For example, you weigh in on things like feminism. I have this book here of yours. It's titled.
Yep. Yeah, that's me and my daughter on the cover, by the way.
Yeah. And she's standing on, I noticed she's standing on some books, and one of them is The Blank Slate.
Yes.
Which I love. That's very sneaky.
So
Stevie,
I was my boy Stevie.
So I was actually reading this on the airplane, and a woman next to me who was decked out in like really expensive branded items. She was older. She just kept giving me the dirty look. She was trying to look at the cover, look at me, and she was like, ugh. You could tell that it was very unsettling. And indeed, the title is very provocative. Don't be a feminist. I know it's framed as a letter to your daughter, a series of essays that are meant to address her. So can you explain to us the thesis of this book? Because this is bombastic. I'm sure you got some pushback just even writing this book. I hope you have tenure. You do, right? Good.
I do. I've had tenure for almost 20 years now.
Okay, good.
Yeah. And I do believe in using tenure to take a stand for unpopular causes that I think are intellectually really solid.
You were doing the Lord's
when other
work.
people are being intimidated to keep their mouths shut. Really, I've been writing the lead essay in this book of essays for about 10 years. As soon as my daughter was born, I'm like, well, demographically, she's real likely to be a feminist. So what do I tell her about this stuff? I think a lot of the best things are things that the author was writing in their heads for many years, and they finally put pen to paper when they're good and ready, and that this is one such essay. So what I say in the essay is as follows. First of all, I say, well, what is a feminist even? All right, there is, if you go and look at dictionaries, a lot of them will just say, it's just the theory that women should be treated equally as men, economically, politically, socially. And I say, well, that's an interesting definition. Let's go to public opinion and see whether it actually makes sense. So there was a major national poll where they went and asked people, first of all, are you feminist or not? And second of all, asked them whether they agreed with the equality of men and women. And guess what? Well, almost all feminists agree that men and women should be equal. Also, almost all non-feminists agree. Way over 90% of non-feminists agree that men and women should be economic, political, social equals, which I say means that cannot possibly be the definition of feminism. It's like saying feminism is the theory the sky is blue. So yeah, well, feminists do believe in the blueness of the sky. And you know what? So does everybody. So it's a terrible definition. What is a more sensible definition? That's one where I say, look at something like this. Feminism is the view that our society generally treats men more fairly than women. The theory that our society generally treats men more fairly than women. Why is this a good definition? Well, first of all, almost everyone who self-identifies as a feminist believes that our society treats men more fairly than women. Second of all, out of people that don't identify, either almost all would be agnostic or they'll just say, no, I disagree. So that is the kind of definition that makes sense because it distinguishes the two views. Now notice, it distinguishes the two views without resolving what is actually the truth, which is also what a good definition does. If your definition builds in the truth of your view, that is a terrible definition. It's one where you're trying to use the dictionary to decide how the world is, and that's not the job of the dictionary. The job of the dictionary is to explain how words are used. It is the job of our eyes to figure out what's really going on. All right, so after going and laying that groundwork, I then say, all right, well, we've got this definition that I think is pretty reasonable, and I think it does fit how people use the word. And then it comes down to the question, well, so who's right? This is where the fact that I'm an economist does give me some professional training, because economists have put a lot of statistical work into questions like this. Questions like, why is there a pay gap between men and women? Right? Does the pay gap reflect actual unfair treatment of women where they are paid differently for the same work? Or is it rather a reflection of the fact that men and women do different kinds of work? And if they were doing the same kinds of work, they would be paid the same. All right, so what I do in the essay is I said, well, let's start off with just a list of all the main complaints about how women are allegedly treated less fairly than men. And again, that less fairly is important because no one's treated fairly all the time. If you just say, hey, I found a case in a society of 330 million people where one woman was mistreated. Yeah, well, there's a lot of bad stuff that happens in the world. So it's got to be some general claim. It can't just be some idiosyncratic, I once knew a woman who suffered in some way. All right, so I go and I make a list of all the standard feminist complaints, which you guys know about. So complaints about work, complaints about division of labor in the home, complaints about objectification, standard list. But then I say, yeah, there's also a bunch of complaints about how men are treated less fairly than women that we don't hear very often, but we ought to go and consider those too. That's what an even-handed consideration of the issue requires. What would those be like? Well, could be things like 90% of all workplace fatalities are male. You could see why someone might think that's unfair, or very large majority of the people in prison are male, for example. All right, so I go and have a list of those. But then after I got those two, I could just say, well, we've got two lists. They balance each other out, but that's a real cop-out. And that's where I say, well, I'm an economist, so I've got some statistical training on how to go and really probe more deeply into these complaints and see how much they hold water. Then what I do in much of the rest of the essay is I just go through them and say, really, almost all these complaints are grossly exaggerated. Men's complaints are exaggerated. Women's complaints are exaggerated. There's usually a much simpler explanation than unfairness going on. Things like a lot of why women make less money than men is because they work fewer hours than men. Even when they're working full time, they're less likely to have the super intense jobs where you're working 60 or 70 hours a week. You also have things like men are a lot more likely than women to do STEM. It's not like STEM fields say no women allowed here. It's that when given a choice, most women aren't very interested in STEM. Right, so I go through all of that. And then there's, to my mind, sort of what like the most fun parts are like, well, Dad, why do you even care? Why is this the essay that you wrote to me? And that's where I go into a lot of the deeper issues, like what is the harm of going and falsely believing that men are treating you very unfairly? I say, yeah, well, there's a bunch of obvious problems, like it makes you bitter, right? If you falsely believe that people in your society are treating you very unfairly, that is likely to lead to, first of all, a lot of self-pity, and secondly, to lead to antipathy towards others, especially men. And I say, look, I don't want you to have these feelings. These feelings are not justified, and they are just a burden to carry through life. And I said, also, it leads you to treat other people unjustly, right? And that's going back to what you're originally talking about, like, your hope that I have tenure. So one way in which the feminist movement really stands out compared to almost any other one is just the level of fear that they generate, right? So I've written a bunch of other controversial books, and for most of them, my friends don't bat an eye. They're like, yeah, sorry, yeah, so you're writing a book against democracy. Great, right? So I did have a book called The Case Against Education, Why the Education System Was a Waste of Time and Money. And a few people said, like, aren't you a little worried that your school might get mad at you? I'm like, a little bit, but I'm going to write it anyway. Actually, my university president took me out to lunch, and we had a pleasant conversation. He didn't change his mind about anything, but still, he didn't threaten me or anything, far from it. But for this one, for Don't Be a Feminist, I had multiple friends staging mini interventions saying, do not do this, Bryan. This is going to be terrible for you. Right? Now, what's going on? Well, they're really afraid. Right? And why are they so afraid? I think there's a pretty obvious answer. People are afraid that feminists will be angry at them and that they are powerful, that they're culturally influential, and they're very touchy. In the end, I feel like my friends have a more negative view of feminism than I do because I'm not as nearly as scared of them as they are, but my friends could be right. So, they could come and try to ruin my life. Like I said, I've got tenure, so I think I'm the kind of person that just ought to stick his neck out and challenge the lightning to strike me. Now, if you read the book, the last thing I want to do is to make anyone angry. My dream is a world where everyone is happy and we all have a pleasant conversation. And at the end, everyone says, yes, you make very good points. Let's change our minds. That's my dream. I do not have a dream of making anyone go to sleep. I know it's a long shot, but still, what I'm going for is never to anger anyone. What I'm going for is to make people think and reassess and say, maybe I've been wrong my whole life. Maybe my whole worldview is mistaken. You've got me thinking about that. Now, today, I just put up a new piece on my Substack, so Hold Fear of Feminism, where I'm saying, look, if I said hi to one of my kids' friends and they ran away in terror, I would say, well, did I do something to scare that kid? Like, I asked my kid, like, was there something I've done that would explain why the kid acts that way? Now, if all my kids' friends started running in terror whenever I said hi, I say, man, I thought I was being a nice guy to them, but obviously I'm coming off as an ogre. All right. Similarly, when feminists see that some people are afraid of them, you'd think at least they wonder, what are we doing that's making people so scared? And if they see that there is widespread fear of them, that is where they'd really take a good hard look in the mirror and say, look, obviously we're really coming off as ogres here. Right now,
well,
correct me if I'm wrong, but like, I'd love to be proven wrong, but it seems like they're going for that. Seems like
there are complexities there, I think.
Yeah,
I think because it's an ideological position, it's a way of being, and it's if the dynamic you've bought into is that what you're doing is trying to take down the power structure which is designed to oppress you, then any sort of fear or anger will be interpreted, I think, as, oh, I'm doing my job. I'm making them nervous because I'm actually, making a dent here. So it's understandable for them to feel that.
Look at the Mormons. Yeah, so I'm not Mormon, but I was in a Mormon Cub Scout group as a kid. I've had a lot of good friends as Mormons. All right, no one's afraid of Mormons. It doesn't matter how much you disagree with them. Almost everyone will say they're really nice. And does it mean that they have no influence? They are one of the fastest growing religious movements in human history by being nice. Right. So the idea,
that's definitely a different approach.
And if you really talk to them, say, well, don't you think there's anything bad going in the world? Don't you think you need to take a stand against it? And all the Mormons I know will say, well, sure, we need to take a stand against it, but we don't want to come off seeming like mean people. We're here to go and share our love of Jesus Christ, and we're just trying to exemplify the kinds of lives that we think people ought to live. And it's and that's why I love you guys. And that's why you are loved. The official Mormon church took out an ad in the musical of the Book of Mormon making fun of them.
Right. Yeah, I heard about that.
That's and the idea that this shows that they're not getting stuff done. They get stuff done. It's just do it with common decency. And I'd recommend to everyone on earth, including probably above all fellow libertarians, that we emulate the Mormons because they've got the right formula for winning hearts and minds.